The most dangerous financial habit in ordinary life is not spending too much. It is leaving money in places that feel safe because they are motionless. That is the first thing I would want you to understand. Most people were taught the wrong emotional lesson about money very early. They were taught that movement is danger and stillness is safety. If cash stays in the bank, it feels untouched. If the balance does not jump around every day, it feels protected. If no chart is involved, no panic is involved. So people work, save, collect a respectable pile, and then park it in an account earning almost nothing while the real world quietly keeps raising the price of everything they will eventually need. They call that prudence. I call it slow surrender. Because money that sits still in an inflationary world is not resting, it is shrinking politely. That is the deeper story here. Not that $10,000 can become something bigger, not that passive investing is easier than day trading, not that Fidelity or Vanguard or any particular ticker is magical. The real story is that many hardworking people are not poor because they fail to earn. They stay financially stuck because they keep putting the little surplus they do build into a container designed to preserve calm, not purchasing power. That is the first great misunderstanding, and until you fix that misunderstanding, no allocation model matters very much. The file you gave me opens with a strong image. You work all day and your money sleeps. That is more than a clever line. It is the entire diagnosis. Labor is active, savings accounts are passive, inflation is active too. So if your labor produces money and that money sits in an account earning less than inflation, then your effort is being converted into an asset that keeps losing real force while you sleep. You are working. Your money is not. The file is exactly right to frame that as unfair. It is unfair. But more importantly, it is optional if you understand what is actually happening. That is why I do not think the real enemy in this story is low returns alone. It is false safety. False safety is one of the most expensive luxuries in all of finance because it feels good while it quietly weakens you. A bank account yielding less than inflation does not look dramatic. It does not insult you with volatility. It does not shock you with red numbers. It just slowly steals your future purchasing power while allowing you to feel responsible. That emotional combination is deadly. If something hurts you and frightens you, you tend to act. If something hurts you while flattering your sense of caution, you tend to keep it forever. That is why savers so often become silent losers. The file makes this point with simple arithmetic, and the arithmetic matters. If inflation runs around 3.3% and the safe fixed deposit or savings yield is around 1.9%, then the real return is negative. That means the apparent safety is actually a guaranteed slow loss in buying power. 10 years later, the nominal balance may still look intact, but what it can buy is weaker. And in wealth building, what matters is not the number of dollars you can admire, it is the quantity of life those dollars can still purchase. That is where the second misunderstanding enters. People think investing begins with size. It does not. It begins with system. This is why I like the file S use of $10,000 as the starting line. Not because $10,000 is a magical number. It is not. The public always wants to turn thresholds into myths. But $10,000 is large enough to feel real and small enough to reveal something important. The difference between a person who has begun building an ownership machine and a person who is still only holding cash. The amount matters less than the behavioral identity attached to it. The moment you stop treating money as something to be stored and begin treating it as something to be allocated, your relationship to wealth changes. That is the first important threshold, not becoming rich, becoming allocative. Most people never make that shift properly because they still think investing means stress screens, tickers, panic, hot stock tips, 1,000 opinions. The file is right to reject that image. If your so-called investment system is turning you into a sleepless amateur trader, that is not financial planning. That is anxiety wearing a brokerage login. Proper asset allocation should feel more like configuring a machine than like picking a fight. You choose the structure, you start it, you check it occasionally. The machine does the repetitive part while you go live your life. That is what passive investing gets right, not laziness process. I have always believed the best systems in finance are the ones that remove the greatest number of self-inflicted errors. Most people do not fail because markets were unknowable. They failed because they kept interrupting the plan with emotion. They bought what sounded exciting, sold what felt scary, confused movement with meaning, and treated every correction as a referendum on their intelligence. A passive allocation system does something extraordinarily valuable. It makes patience executable that matters far more than people realize. Now let me talk about the three myths the file attacks because all three are worth preserving and sharpening. The first myth is that saving is safe and investing is dangerous. Number saving is stable in nominal terms. Investing is unstable in nominal terms. Those are not the same thing as safe and dangerous. Real safety means preserving and growing purchasing power over long periods. If your savings account guarantees a small nominal gain and a real loss after inflation, then the emotional stillness is not genuine safety. It is just a smoother form of decay. By contrast, broad productive assets fluctuate wildly in the short run but have historically grown strongly over the long run because they are claims on real businesses, profits, prices, and human enterprise. The market scares you in the short term and often protects you far better in the long term. The bank does the opposite. That is one of the most important reversals in all of personal finance. The second myth is that you need huge money to begin. Again, no, you need enough money to begin behaving differently. That is a very different requirement. The file is correct that $10,000 is already enough to build a system. You do not refuse to exercise because the first weight is only 10 pounds. You do not refuse to plant because the first seed is small. You begin because beginning is what turns theory into identity. A person with $10,000 and a functioning allocation process is closer to wealth than a person with much more money but no system, no discipline, and no structure. Wealth is not only a quantity, it is a pattern. That is why starting matters. The third myth is that investing means endless analysis, sometimes, but not for the ordinary person trying to build long-term freedom while holding a job, a family, and a real life. The file is absolutely right that most workers should not be spending hours pretending to become one-person active management shops. Your time is worth too much, your peace matters too much, and the evidence is too clear that frequent reacting usually harms returns. The spirit of passive investing is not that markets are perfect. It is that your life is usually better served by joining the broad compounding machine than by trying to outwit it every Tuesday. That is wisdom, not surrender. Now let us come to the structure itself, because this is where the file gets practical and where I want to keep the strongest bones while rebuilding the body. The three-layer model is excellent. A safety net, a growth engine, opportunity bullets. That is not just allocation, that is psychological architecture. And psychological architecture is the difference between plans people admire and plans people can actually survive. The safety net matters first. The file holds back 20% or $2,000 out of the $10,000 as non-investment cash, a high-yield savings account, a money market fund, a short-term reserve. Some people hear that and say it is inefficient. Fine, those people do not understand human beings. The reserve is not there to maximize return. It is there to prevent self-destruction, because the greatest threat to a long-term investment plan is not usually that the expected return came in 0.7% too low. The greatest threat is that some emergency arrives, the investor has no cushion, and good assets get sold at the exact wrong time just to solve a short-term problem. That is what the reserve prevents. It buys emotional continuity, and emotional continuity is worth far more than a slightly higher forecasted return. This is why I like the file S marathon metaphor. If you sprint the first miles without reserve, you are not brave, you are fragile. Same with portfolios. A portfolio without cash breathing room often looks efficient on paper and behaves terribly in the real world because life refuses to honor the spreadsheet. Pipes burst, jobs disappear, medical costs arrive, cars revolt. The emergency fund is not for the market, it is for your own continuity as an owner. That is an extraordinarily valuable role. Then comes the growth engine. And here the file is even stronger. 60% of the capital goes into long-term productive compounding, broad stock ETFs plus bond ETFs, growth plus stability, risk plus ballast. This is grown-up allocation because it does not ask one asset class to do every job. Stocks are there to expand purchasing power and ride the growth of business over long time spans. Bonds are there to reduce the violence of the ride, to provide steadier ballast, to offer a different return stream, and to keep the owner from confusing courage with concentration. I especially respect the 70-30th split inside this sleeve, 70% of the growth engine to broad market equity, 30% to bonds or high quality fixed income exposure. That is not the hottest portfolio you can build. Good heat is overrated. This kind of mix is designed to let you stay alive emotionally through years that would otherwise teach you to abandon the machine at exactly the wrong time. That is why balance matters. The public keeps overpaying for upside and underpaying for survivability. But in long-term compounding, survivability is what lets upside become yours. The file also does something very important here. It recommends dollar cost averaging the growth engine over 6 months rather than dropping the entire $6,000 in at once. I think that is wise for the kind of investors thesis aimed at, yes, lump sum investing often wins mathematically in long historical studies because markets tend to rise more than they fall. Fine, but the adult question is not merely what wins in abstract averages, it is what lets this actual person begin. If spreading the entry over 6 months keeps a new investor from panic, regret, and paralysis, then that smoother sequence may be the superior behavioral choice, even if it surrenders a little theoretical edge some years. Again, process beats purity. Now let us come to the third bucket, the opportunity bullets. This is where the file is smarter than many passive investing sermons, because it recognizes a truth the public does not like hearing. Pure full deployment feels efficient, but dry powder has value when volatility arrives, the final 20%. Or $2,000 is held back as flexible cash or near cash so the owner can buy during meaningful drawdowns rather than merely watching them. This is not market timing. In the childish sense, it is optionality. Optionality matters. The file uses a 15% market decline as a personal rule for beginning deployment. And I think the exact threshold matters less than the principle underneath it. Keep something liquid enough that fear in the market can become opportunity for you instead of only pain. That changes the entire emotional relationship with corrections. The average person sees a sharp drop and feels attacked. The person with reserves and a rule set feels invited. That is a profound difference. It turns volatility from a threat into a scheduled possibility. The file notes that the reserve cash might underperform if markets keep rising. Good, that is the trade-off, and the mature investor accepts trade-offs, instead of pretending every decision should maximize every variable at once. The opportunity cash is not there to win every month. It is there to preserve strategic flexibility. If the market melts upward forever, fine, you sacrifice some return. If the market breaks hard, that cash becomes one of the most psychologically valuable assets in the whole portfolio. Both outcomes are understandable. What matters is knowing why the money sits there. This is where I think the entire three-layer structure becomes more than an allocation model. It becomes an operating system. The safety net protects continuity. The growth engine compounds. The bullets convert fear into opportunity. That is elegant, and more importantly, it is livable. That is why I respect it. The file then moves into execution, and here again the simplicity is exactly the virtue. Open the brokerage account, set the automatic transfer, pick the ETFs rebalance every 6 months, learn but do not overreact. This all sounds almost too boring to deserve serious attention. Good, boring is where wealth is actually built. The public keeps looking for the secret move, the hidden fund, the superior edge. Usually the real edge is behavioral automation. The less often you need to make fresh emotional decisions, the less damage your emotions can do. That is what automation solves. A direct debit from the bank into the brokerage the day after payday is not just a convenience. It is a way of removing your future weak self from the decision chain. The money moves before excuses form. That is what systems do. Systems reduce the number of moments where your temporary mood gets a vote. I trust systems much more than motivation. Motivation is weather. Systems are plumbing. The file is also right about rebalancing. And I want to linger there because people always misunderstand why rebalancing is so useful. Selling some of what is done well to add to what has lagged feels counterintuitive because the human mind wants to chase visible strength, but rebalancing is one of the only built-in ways a portfolio can force the owner to behave better than his instincts would choose. It says you are not here to worship winners. You are here to maintain structure. That often means trimming what ran and feeding what cooled. Over time, this disciplines greed and fear with almost no philosophical drama at all. That is excellent design. And excellent design is what keeps ordinary people from turning ordinary volatility into extraordinary mistakes. Now let us address the return expectations, because this is where people get impatient and therefore stupid. The file estimates that a 70/30 portfolio might earn something like 6 to 8% annualized over long periods. Good, sensible, reasonable, not exciting enough to seduce the reckless, which is one more reason I like it. A 7% annualized return does not sound like liberation when heard in isolation. That is exactly why so many people ignore it. But the purpose of return is not to impress you in year one. It is to transform time itself into an ally if you keep feeding the machine. At 7%, 10 years roughly doubles, 20 years becomes meaningful, 30 years becomes astonishing. And once you add consistent monthly contributions on top of the initial $10,000, the machine changes character entirely. The file is correct that an extra $200 a month can turn the long-run picture into something far larger than most people emotionally associate with just a simple passive allocation. That is because people keep underestimating repetition. Repetition is a hidden millionaire, not brilliance, not heat, not excitement. Repetition, the file, is also admirable in the way it treats human capital. This is the part many investing channels skip because it is less clickable than tickers. But it may be the most important sentence in the entire piece. Your own earning ability is still your biggest asset. That is exactly right. If you are 30 and earn $60,000 a year, the lifetime cash flow from your own labor can reach millions. That dwarfs what most people start with in accounts, which means the point of investing is not to worship the portfolio in isolation. It is to convert part of the labor engine into the capital engine over time. That is the real bridge. And if you improve the labor engine through skills, career moves, and network growth, then the amount available to feed the capital engine rises. That is why the smartest investors are not only buying ETFs, they are also increasing the size of the fuel pipe. Higher earnings plus automated investing plus long-time horizons is one of the most powerful combinations in the ordinary world. That is how boring people become wealthy. The file's example of the friend who doubled salary and therefore accelerated contributions is directionally perfect. The portfolio did not suddenly work because one fund became magical. It worked faster because the contribution stream got stronger. That matters because people love to obsess over what asset will turn $10,000 into $300,000 the lazy way. Fine. But the truly adult question is often simpler and much more useful. How can I increase the amount and consistency of what I am feeding into the machine while keeping the machine itself intelligent and boring? That is the real question. And that is why I think the title needs a deeper interpretation. The lazy way does not mean the owner becomes passive about life. It means the owner stops demanding daily labor from the portfolio. You still work hard, you still improve, you still earn, you still think. But you stop requiring your investment system to entertain you. The laziness is in the operation, not in the seriousness. That is an important difference. Because if you are not careful, the word lazy attracts the wrong person. It attracts the person who wants wealth without discipline. This system is not for him. This system is for the person willing to do the right thing repeatedly and then get out of the way. That is a very different kind of discipline. It is quiet discipline, and quiet discipline compounds. Now let me say something about fear, because fear is where most good systems get abandoned. The file is honest that markets will crash, accounts will fall, and bad periods will feel terrible. Good, that honesty matters. Every adult system must be built to survive the truth, not a fantasy. If you cannot emotionally survive a 30% drawdown in equities, then you should not own an all-equity portfolio. If you cannot stand seeing red numbers, then some bond ballast and reserve cash are not just strategic, they are essential. A plan that breaks your behavior is not a good plan, even if it looked efficient on paper. This is why I like the line that your biggest enemy is not the market, but your own emotions. That is overused language in finance. But here it is appropriate. The market's violence is not the final risk. Your reaction to the violence is the final risk. The entire 20 divided by 60 divided by 20 structure exists to reduce the chance that emotion becomes your portfolio manager. The reserve protects you from emergency selling. The bonds reduce the stomach churning amplitude. The bullets convert drawdowns into action rather than helplessness. The automation reduces procrastination. The rebalancing rules reduce impulse. This is not just an allocation, it is anti-self-destruction engineering. That is what makes it strong. If I had to summarize the whole story in one sentence, I would say this. The real purpose of a $10,000 allocation system is not to maximize excitement. It is to turn a pile of idle money into a disciplined machine that preserves your future purchasing power, compounds without daily supervision, and gives you enough stability that you do not ruin the process when the market becomes emotionally unpleasant. That is the real promise, not getting rich in a year, not outperforming your neighbors, not becoming a macro genius, building a machine. That is what most people need, because the ordinary household is not being destroyed by a lack of access to information. It is being destroyed by a lack of systems. Money comes in, bills come out, some excess remains, the excess sits, inflation eats, years pass, regret accumulates. That is the default track. A system breaks that track. It does not need to be glamorous. It needs to be repeatable. This is where I become very Buffett about the whole thing. I like things that work because they are simple enough to survive human nature. A broad stock fund works because it captures productive enterprise. A bond fund works because it stabilizes behavior and risk. An emergency reserve works because life refuses to honor spreadsheets. a buy. The dip reserve works because volatility is not rare enough to ignore. Automatic investing works because your future self is not always reliable. Rebalancing works because greed and fear are permanent features of ownership. That is the whole symphony. Nothing here is individually breathtaking. Together, it becomes powerful. That is how most enduring wealth systems are built, not out of one genius note, out of a few ordinary notes played correctly for a very long time. If I had to leave you with one final line, it would be this. Money becomes dangerous when it is mistaken for safety while it sits still. Money becomes useful when it is placed inside a structure that lets time work on it harder than inflation can. That is what your $10,000 is really for. Not to look respectable in the bank, to become the first working employee in a machine that may one day free you from having to carry the whole financial future on your own back.